Excellent. Good morning. Thanks for having me here. This is an excellent panel. Some of the folks on this panel keep me very busy, some of you as well. But we're going to have time for questions, I hope. So as we go along, keep thinking what you might want to ask folks, and then I'll let you know when we're ready. And if you could just line up at these microphones here, hopefully we'll have plenty of time keep this interactive. So again, I'm Paul Fain with Inside Higher Ed. A few years ago, when I first started writing about competency-based education, I'm pretty sure I was one of maybe 2 or 3 reporters who was doing that. That has changed. I've been kind of left in the dust as the mainstream media is all over this. Even the New York Times, which generally avoids writing about non-traditional students or the kind of non-elite market. They're very interested in some institutions right around here. But they have written about competency-based education lately, and I was actually on a panel with Anya Kamenetz, who's a writer with Fast Company, who did a great piece for the Times, and complimented her on getting it in the Times. And she said, part of what helped was that the University of Wisconsin was now involved, and that school, to some of the parents of potential students who read the New York Times, is of interest. Maybe a safety school, no offense to Wisconsin. But the expansion of the field, and I would love some folks here to talk about how many schools are getting into this. The range of schools is just amazing. This is so hot news, I haven't even written it yet, but the University of Michigan wrote me on Friday to say that they had been approved by their accreditor for a competency-based degree, a master's in health, and also a direct assessment degree, which means non-credit hours. So, when you've got elite institutions getting involved in this, things are happening fast. So I will stop talking because no one wants to hear me. But what we're going to do is just a very quick introduction of everyone here by themselves. If you're interested in their many laurels and accomplishments, their bios are on the web, so you can look them up. But we're just going to very quickly ask each of them to talk about who they are and how their work kind of touches on competency-based education. So, Pam, would you like to start us off? Pam Tate with CAEL.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm the president and CEO of CAEL, which is the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And CAEL has made it a 40-year effort to try to remove the barriers for adult learners returning to higher education or starting for the first time. And we became interested in the area of competency-based education really at the start of CAEL, because it is a way of removing barriers and allowing adults to bring learning that has occurred all over, to demonstrate that learning and count it toward a degree. So we've been quite interested in the field and very excited about its growth and sort of reemergence, and happy to be here.
Amy Laitinen with New America.
Great. Hi, can you hear me? Wonderful. So Amy Laitinen with the New America Foundation, a think tank, nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. So a few years ago, I wrote a piece called Cracking the Credit Hour, which really tried to look at some of the history of the credit hour, of this artificial measure, sort of proxy measure of learning. And, none of what was in there was new. It was really acknowledging the work that CAEL and many of the folks, and some of the folks in this room have been doing for years, in addition to recognizing some of the new efforts that are happening. I think sort of my different spin on this is looking at federal policy. So I had just come out of working in the U.S. Department of Education, which had recently regulated on the credit hour, and people may know that, and I'm going to get things thrown at me because of my association with the Department of Education, but I am a recovering non-apologetic Fed, and so my interest in this is really trying to figure out how the federal government can harness the $150 billion a year that it spends on Title IV, and currently is paying for time rather than learning, and trying to figure out how it can do, how it can stop doing that.
Great. So Alison Kadlec, Public Agenda.
Hi, I'm Alison Kadlec from Public Agenda. I'm assuming you can hear me. I'm quite loud to begin with in this microphone here. So Public Agenda is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and stakeholder engagement organization with a mission of helping diverse leaders and publics navigate complex and divisive issues. And so it turns out that there's an awful lot of work in higher ed. And so for the last 2 years, I have been working in support of the Competency-Based Education Network. How many CBEN institutions are in the room? Can't hide in the shadows, okay. So this is a network of institutions that are working together to surface and tackle shared challenges in policy and practice around building high-quality, scalable CBE models capable of serving many more students of all backgrounds. So that's my role.
Holly, Educause.
Good morning. I'm Holly Morris. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Holly Morris. I'm with Educause. I'm the Director of Post-Secondary Model Development and Adoption for Next Generation Learning Challenges. And I think I've been asked to be here because of my role as the architect and executor for the Breakthrough Models Incubator, which is a unique opportunity for leadership teams of higher education institutions to take a few days to pause and think about how they can create breakthrough models for their institutions. So this year we've been focusing exclusively on competency-based education. So there are 9 new teams at work as we speak, bringing forward new degree programs that are aligned with competency-based principles. And we'll be doing the same next year in 2015. So glad to be here. Thanks.
Great. So Nick Lee with Bill Melinda Gates Foundation.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I work at the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. I focus specifically on policy issues. I too, like Amy, am a recovering federal employee. I've had a longer, I think, tenure, but still recovering. The post-secondary success strategy at the Gates Foundation is really focused on significantly increasing the number of particularly low-income individuals that have marketable credentials, and we are invested in a variety of different things that will help students do that. Everything from figuring out, are there better ways of doing developmental education, to are there different tools that can be leveraged to provide better advising services to students. And obviously one of those innovations, which we'll be spending a bit of time here on today, will be competency-based education. My job at the Gates Foundation is focused on how do you create the right policy environment to enable experimentation, scaling of myriad solutions that our strategy is looking at that will ultimately be helpful in lifting up low-income students. So thank you.
Excellent. So as we get started here, Holly and Alison, if you wouldn't mind, could you give folks an idea of the scale, the number of institutions that you're working with who are actively involved in building these programs?
Sure. So in September of 2012, and this was the first time that I got involved in this work, Public Agenda was asked to help facilitate or design a convening for the institutions that were identified then as working seriously in the space. And seriously meant working on full degree sequences, full degree programs. And at that point, in September of 2012, it was 20 institutions that were identified. And so, about half of those were first-generation innovators from the 1970s, and the other half were new model innovators, Northern Arizona, Southern New Hampshire, Wisconsin. Since then, as we continue to do a scan of the environment, that number has grown to possibly over 200, although it's very hard to say exactly who's doing what in this space, which is unnerving and interesting. CBEN is currently 20 institutions representing 34 campuses, but we are going to be doing another round of RFPs and imagine that number will be growing by maybe another dozen in the next few months. So that's the number that we're working with, but it is an explosion of activity in the space.
Holly?
I don't really have much to add to that, except that it is just growing exponentially. And it is also amplified by work in community colleges that aren't well represented in VMI's cohort yet. And I don't know how many community colleges are working in CBEN, but it's a sort of a natural fit for community colleges to go after CBE, and they're cranking that up too. So.
Great. So I want to get into the basics of what exactly competency-based education is and some of the semantics. Before I do that, I take the reporter's privilege and throw a curveball out here.
Great.
You know, I think when I first started writing about competency-based ed, you know, Western Governors was what we wrote about, and they're still extremely active in the space, do great work. Alverno, decades ago, was doing this. Why now? Why is this happening? Why the explosion? Why so many folks in the room? Anyone want to talk about the conditions that are making this so alluring to institutions and students?
Well, I think when I talk to institutions and state policy leaders and employers, what they say is that, number one, the degree completion agenda, period, is driving this. That the fact that so many states are moving to performance funding or some version of it, and that the colleges are feeling the drive to help students be successful, both adults and traditional undergraduates. So there's this drive to completion, and there's this thought that competency-based education and prior learning assessment, these kinds of innovations are going to help people. And then I think, as we were saying earlier together, I think employers, the interest we see, anyway, from the private sector, a lot of employers are really pushing for having a clearer idea of what people know and can do in the workplace. And they would like to know what college graduates have to offer, or what their workers will have if they send them back. So colleges are responding as well to employer demand. And I just would add that in the 20-plus institutions and systems that we're working with on the CBE Jumpstart program, that is, they all say that those are the two drivers for them.
Any other reasons? Go ahead.
So I would just add, and I think we'll probably end up talking about this throughout the day in terms of some of the risks of this, but I think cost is also a huge issue. I mean, I think at the federal policy level, sort of in DC, we're hearing so much about about college costs, and then there are these, sort of associated issues around completion, as you talked about, around employers not being satisfied with college graduates, around, students taking on so much debt, and at the end of it, having a degree, but very little evidence of student learning. And I think, in my mind, it's the evidence of student learning piece that is most alarming, but in terms of the rhetoric and the narrative that's driving a lot of the policy conversations, it really is around cost. And I think that is a really great opportunity for us to leverage, this conversation around quality and around competency, but there is certainly a danger that it just becomes this sort of, faster, cheaper, lesser option, and I imagine and hope we will talk about that throughout the day.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Okay, so despite the excitement, I feel like this is still not well understood by the general public, reporters, and policymakers sometimes. So when you hear, what do you classify as being a competency-based education program? And if you'd like, what is it? What are some things that folks talk about in this space that really don't count? Anyone want to jump in?
So you want to do don't count before we do?
Let's do count. There we go. What is
The answer's up there.
The answer's
Okay, I'm not going to look at the answer. I'm not going to look at. Well, so when I think about, for example, when my family or friends or people ask, what the hell is that? What are you talking about?
the elevator speech?
The elevator speech, and I don't have a successful one yet, but I find myself explaining to family members and friends, particularly friends who were not particularly well served by traditional higher ed, right? So the adult friends that I have who are figuring out how to navigate professional lives in a vulnerable economy without post-secondary credentials. And I say, so competency-based education or proficiency-based education is a way for learners to make progress toward degrees and credentials based on what they know and are able to do, instead of simply based on the time spent in a seat or in a classroom. And at that point, usually they say, oh, well, tell me more about that, and then you can go from there. But that's the place that I start, but that's never enough, right? Which is why we have this behind us, so.
Anyone else?
Well, I will. Oh, sorry. Go. No, please. You've been doing this for 40 years.
No, I was just going to say that I also think of it as a model in which a person can build on what they have already done and what they already know. That's why we have been so interested in it for so long, because it actually takes seriously what somebody brings to the table and doesn't expect them to start all over again and relearn. If they can demonstrate it, then they can move on. And I just think that's the exciting potential of it.
So as the skeptical journalist, when you see interest like this, it's not quite to the MOOC hysteria level, but it's definitely getting there. You wonder if institutions might start dressing up programs that really are learning outcomes, which they should have been tracking anyhow. And I know Carol Gary Schneider is here to talk about some of these issues. Where do you put the line here? What are there programs that you think really don't shouldn't be called competency-based education? Are there things that you see out there that fall below that bar?
I think the key to me about competency-based education is inverting the relationship between time and learning, so that the focus is on what you are learning and not how long you've spent in the seat. So any program that doesn't fundamentally start from that premise of flipping the relationship between time and learning, I think probably wouldn't meet my definition of competency-based education. And the opportunity with competency-based education, because it is focused on outcomes and what you do, there's a real opportunity to accelerate and improve the quality of what you're offering and what students are demonstrating, because most of competency-based education is assessed authentically. With some exceptions, like prior learning assessment, which you might be able to come in and demonstrate something that you already know. But to me, if a program really doesn't tailor itself towards outcomes and relevant outcomes that are aligned to workforce demands as well as intellectual requirements at the same time, that wouldn't meet my definition of competency.
And I would just simply add, I think it's this concreteness that allows, frankly, a lot of folks, maybe beyond the current folks that might be evaluating traditional program, in this case employers, just general concerned public, they can say, I can see what that assessment is, and I can see the demonstration of that concrete competency, and I can judge for myself in a slightly more transparent manner whether or not I believe that's worthy of being considered a competency-based program. I think that's part of the promise that's offered, and I want to stress that word promise. This is in very early days, and part of the big set of investments I think we're invested in is really building that evidence base, understanding, is this actually doable? Is it doable in a transparent manner that makes sense to the field? And I think that's the promise that we're hoping to test over these coming years with some of the folks in this room.
Paul, I also just would add that when I think about learning outcomes in courses and programs that have made a stress on defining learning outcomes, those can be defined in content terms. You need to master certain content. And a lot of liberal arts courses, for example, still are based on that. You need to have an understanding of this or an understanding of that or grasp this particular subject area. But I do think competence goes beyond that, to beyond the content mastery. And that's probably the dividing line for me. And you know, in the LEAP, in the AAC&U LEAP framework, it's very clear that it's not just about knowing something about content, it's about application. That seems to be the critical difference.
Amy, you look like you had it.
Well, no, I would just agree with that. I mean, I think that there are a lot of schools that might be interested in sort of dressing up, sort of saying, okay, this is the new sexy term, so we're going to write grants for this, and we're going to just repackage what it is that we're doing to sort of call it competency-based education and do some window dressing. But it's interesting when you say I think you said window dressing in terms of learning outcomes. And I guess for me, and this, wow, wouldn't that be an amazing outcome if actually we were all focused on, the window dressing was learning outcomes. I mean, to me, like competency-based education, and I'm thinking much more broadly here, is the radical idea that higher education should be about learning.
Aren't all institutions doing learning?
Right, exactly. So, you know, but to Nick's point, the idea, you know, sort of learning and application, what can you do with it? Can you solve complex problems with new information? You know, how do you take, and then how does anyone have trust in that outcome, right? You know, I just don't think it's enough for higher education. I realize I'm in, you know, a room full of higher education folks to just sort of say, trust us, we'll take care of it, you know, sort of, we'll take your students, we'll take your money, and it'll be fine. No, I think actually CBE is really about demonstrating to everyone what students know and can do.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not here to have a lengthy discussion of the semantics issue around competency-based education, which could go on for some time.
I hear a but coming.
There's always a but. But briefly, you know, there are some other terms that get used in addition to competency. We hear proficiency. Any thoughts about the variation in language and you know, whether you think some of the words should change or will? Anyone want to take that
That's
one on?
tough.
Nick, you're being quiet over there.
This, I'd actually toss this, and this is something that the CBEN institutions are.
You're working on
It's something that
Yeah,
the CBEN
it's true.
institutions are working on right
That's
now.
right.
Actually,
Good point.
So I would say there are a couple of things here. So, and I think this will come up at least in one subsequent session. I think the distinction between proficiency and competency is an important one, and it's one that we should understand and articulate. I think Carol Gary Schneider does the best job of articulating that difference. I think the degree qualification profile authors do that. I will say, however, that it's, so I think it's an important intellectual and I think it's an important practical distinction. The term that gets used in the world right now is competency-based education. And so I'm torn between recognizing and thinking it's extremely important to make those distinctions and to understand why those distinctions are made for DQP authors and others. At the same time, I've always been more of a on mission rather than being on message. And so I think if we are clear about what it is that we're talking about in terms of quality and rigor and cross-cutting capabilities, and I think that's really important. So I do think on the one hand, there are important distinctions. On the other hand, I think we see it a lot in the field of activity of institutions that have a particular interest in defining terms in particular ways because it is such a robust and varied field. There isn't one model, right? And so, and we at CBEN, the premise is we want to protect the healthy development of diversity in the field and diverse models, and that means allowing for diverse vocabularies. And early on we thought, well, if we could come to a taxonomy that everybody could agree on, then we could move forward on this. And we realized that rested on a false premise, because what we were trying to do was say there are sort of grotesque mischaracterizations or potentially harmful representations of ideas, and if we had the right language, we could get past that. But the fact is that a lot of the different terms that are used are simply the result of different models. They're actually not the result of misunderstanding. They're the result of honest differences in models and approaches. And so understanding core features that cut across different models and working from there to surface shared standards of practice is ultimately far more important, I think, than which terms you use, because then you get mired in defense of particular models and that sort of thing. So that was not a satisfying answer, and I apologize to everybody.
Well, so I would just add and sort of underscore, sort of being super in the weeds on this stuff, I could talk for hours with folks about proficiency and competency, but I don't know how helpful that is for the broader conversation, right? The folks on the Hill and folks in state legislatures are not sort of saying, oh, this is competency, this is math. They're not doing that. And if we're spending our energy sort of wordsmithing this internally, then we are losing the message outside. In the meantime, you have state legislatures and ALEC who are saying, CBE is what we need to be focusing on because we need a $10,000 degree. It's cheaper. Whoa, then all of a sudden, we might get it right, theoretically, intellectually, but we've lost the battle, and all of a sudden, everything is about sort of cheaper, faster, and we've lost the quality conversation. We have created a two-tiered system. And so, again, this is sort of my vantage point coming from a policy doing sort of standpoint, but I do understand that there are differences, but I think too, there are folks who I've talked to who really see competency as two different things. Like competency is sort of bare minimum, or competency is absolutely the highest peak. And having internal conversations and us coming to an agreement about, first of all, will take forever. We're talking about academics. So we might have an agreement 10 years from now. In the meantime, the ship has sailed.
Well, that's a relief to me, because I'm not looking forward to explaining to readers the difference of a new term like competency. So looking forward, and that's always dangerous to do, particularly these days, where would you like to see this movement go in a decade or so? I imagine there's some institutions out there that haven't really taken the leap on competency-based ed, that might be thinking about it. Do you feel like, can you give some sense of where you would like to see institutions try new things and experiment here? Anyone?
Well, as in thinking about back to our CBE Jumpstart initiative, the idea is to start new institutions who have not done this before, and get them thinking about it, figuring out what programs, models, which degree programs, which disciplines to tackle. If we could expand the number of institutions doing experiments, help them with pioneering efforts like the CBEN institutions that were first created. Let those institutions be the lead the way models, and also making the first mistakes and figuring out where the administrative structures are, how to price such programs, what new faculty roles are required, but then let the leading group start to inform all these new players at the table. It's like field building of any kind. I think we've got several layers of field building to do, and I'd like to see in the next 10 years a broadening of the application of these models and testing them out and finding out what does it do for degree completion? Does it make college more affordable? Do more people complete, or is it really, in many cases, we're seeing it's a harder way to get a degree? I mean, to demonstrate competency is no easy thing. If you look at some of the competence frameworks of the colleges that are the first, 60, 70 colleges working on this, these are not easy things to demonstrate. So I'm not so sure that we're going to just see right off the bat, high completion rates. We may see some other movement in between now and 5 years from now. So I think we need research, we need field building, we need evidence, and we need leaders in the field to help others. And it's like any new movement that needs those various stages of the pioneers, the second wave adopters, and then the later adopters. And we need to build the same movement here.
I would say that there's two things that are interesting to me, hopefully that can happen over the next years. One is certainly the evidence, and I said that earlier, there needs to be evidence. Does this actually work? And if it doesn't, then I'm pretty sure we're not going to keep on investing money into it.
Is there evidence out there? Is there any evidence right now?
I think so there's evidence. I wouldn't say evidence. I would say that there's understanding of sort of how some pioneering institutions are setting these things up, starting to understand sort of what the cost models look like. But in terms of the real outcomes that people want to know, does it actually result in a lower cost but similar or higher quality credential for the student? Is there actually tight alignment that is appealing to employers? I think the jury's still out on all those things, and that's why that understanding needs to be built, hopefully over the next 10 years. I think two areas that hopefully two things that can happen over the next 10 years, assuming that evidence exists. One is because of some of this concreteness that we're hopeful for around competency. One thing that I know my foundation in particular is very interested in is how does that information then get translated back into the K-12 classroom? If you can understand at a concrete level what you're trying to teach a student in post-secondary education, can you start laying those building blocks in high school, in junior high school, in a way right now that, that ties perhaps to the Common Core. A lot of folks right now are trying to figure out how to implement the Common Core. That would sort of be the natural linkage that would frankly get higher ed and K-12 talking in a more concrete way, as opposed to saying, it'd be good to have higher ed engage in the Common Core conversation, but there's no list of learning objectives. That's hard to do. The second, which I think part of the reason why I think a lot of folks are interested in competency right now is there's a cool technology aspect to it, right? Whenever policymakers talk to me, they're saying, can you bring in some of the toys and talk to us about all this cool technology? And I'm like, well, the technology is great, but it's the learning that we're interested in. So we'll bring that to the table, and obviously some folks here would do that, but it has to be tied to the learning. And part of the value of the technology tied to the competency-based education models that are growing right now is the data, the information about the learning. And that information about the learning can then be tailored into how do I figure out how to better support the student? If I know this student is not doing very well in this particular learning objective, guess what? I can develop student support services that are targeted on that particular need, as opposed to just holistically saying, you need algebra tutoring. So that's one of the huge promises that we're just building the data right now. The data are just being set up, and then it's translating the data and giving it to the folks who can actually do something valuable with it. We're thinking that's something that could happen in the next 10 years.
So there are two things that I would love to see happen. One is for those who are building these programs, the emergence of shared standards of practice and quality across different models while protecting diversity of models. But apart from that, watching the institutions that I have the privilege to work with struggle with truly building programs, right? So working at programmatic level outcomes, formative and summative assessment, backward design, the most robust kind of learning outcomes work. I would love to see that conversation more meaningfully intersect with what traditional higher education is doing and thinking about in this country, so that the questions that institutions everywhere, regardless of what kind of model, traditional, not traditional, CBE, credit-based, course-based, that we are talking and working truly on, and I say this as a former faculty member too, truly working on the most robust kinds of learning outcomes work, so that we're genuinely thinking about what are the skills and habits and dispositions and abilities befitting a free people, and how are we actually making that truly available to all learners, regardless of accidents of birth or fortune. So essentially, I want to see how CBE can help this country fulfill its sort of social contract that it has with its people. So, not very ambitious, but like to aim low.
I'm hopeful that our endeavors in CBE are going to really steer higher education towards being student-centric in its development of what we offer them and how we offer it to them. I think we have a tremendous opportunity here to help not just 37 million Americans who have some college credit and no college degree and debt to go with it, but also to offer an opportunity to high school students who are in competency-based programs now and looking for, hoping desperately to find a place where they can continue their learning in a way that makes sense to them. This is a tremendous opportunity, I think, for marginalized learners to come into and have a part of that all-important American dream.
Sure.
Wait, I have one more thing, I'm sorry. As we were talking, I was thinking about one of the things that I would love to see happen over the next 10 years is, as this work becomes more mature, my hope is that it can help impact what is now the tremendously dysfunctional credit transfer process in this country. As we're talking about the 37 million students who have some credits and no credentials, the time and money and sense of hope and possibility that is lost when students try to transfer credits between institutions, and 2/3 of all students take credits from multiple institutions. We are in a completely different world, and the profound dysfunction around credit transfer in this country is something that I hope that CBE can help address.
So since Alison brought up dysfunction, can I have my wish list for, in addition to everything else, it would be great if there could be a legislative and regulatory environment that was not dysfunctional, and that where there were better relationships with accreditors, with institutions, and with the department, and with Congress and state legislatures, for example, to really figure out how you strike that balance between innovation and protecting students and taxpayers from fraud and abuse. So.
Yeah, just one other thing, since we're on the wish list. I would also like to see a growth and a delineation of roles and responsibilities between employers and colleges and universities on this whole issue. I think if we could have in-depth conversations at the industry level and in regions about what are the skills and knowledge and competencies that industries and companies are after, and have colleges hearing that. And what's amazing is how close they really are to the outcomes of liberal arts education. But a lot of the individual colleges don't really pay attention to what employers have to say. So I'd like to see more effort over this period in joint design.
And to plug something, that's happening at a small degree right now. We in the ACT Foundation have invested in sort of the national network of business and industry, where they've mapped out sort of for 12 different industries, what are the competencies? Right. And imagine how powerful that would be to hand off to a competence-based program and say, hey, if we do these, our students would get jobs in these industries. It's like a one-to-one match. That's just starting, but the grander vision, obviously, over the next 10 years would be how many more industries can we add to that?
So I was going to stick with the promise of competency-based ed for a while. I think it's time to move to the pitfalls and traps.
Yeah, I felt it coming somehow. We're all getting excited about what it could look like.
We're changing the world.
Right.
So several were raised already there. I think let's start with cost, though, in the way it's discussed and the potential for separate but unequal pathways. You know, inside higher ed, we don't use the word cheap because it you know, obviously has a pejorative sound to it. We do less expensive, less affordable. Yes. You know, how do you see that issue coming to a head? Is it a policymaker piece? Is it you know, is there a backlash that could come from policymakers or the general public? And we'll start with you since you raised that.
Well, I do think, okay, so now I've said it a few times. I think that the idea of cheaper is certainly appealing, especially, I mean, it's appealing to everyone, right? Well, almost everybody wants cheaper, especially as college costs increase. But I think we are already seeing this push. So it's, you know, not the potential pitfalls, but the pitfalls that are happening. So ALEC, what does ALEC stand for? The American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yeah, something like that.
They have their, you know, very effective lobbying organization that works at the state level to push particular policies and
to help draft policies even.
Yeah, to draft policies. They basically do plug and play legislation. So here's the specs, here's the line items, you know, just sort of insert your state's name here and bring it to your state legislature. They've been very effective, you know, in all sorts of ways. I'm raising my eyebrows so that I don't verbally comment on, you know, how effective they've been in certain
different panel.
areas. That's a different panel. But they only, I think, had one higher ed policy that they were pushing this year, and it was really for low cost, you know, these $10,000 degrees, and to encourage state legislatures to adopt CBE. So that's already happening, right? And if we don't get to the, if we don't sort of say, okay, fine, maybe you're going to push on the cost piece, and I'm actually okay and opportunistic and sort of letting folks talk about cost if it gets them to the table to talk about the other things, but let's make sure that it is high quality education. And so that it isn't this sort of two-tiered, okay, well, this is going to be this sort of cheaper option for those students, you know, who are already not served well by traditional higher ed, that this is the promise that it's going to serve them well, but it actually isn't going to serve them well. We're just going to give them crappy degrees, charge them $10,000 for it, feel good about ourselves, and move on.
Yeah, at this point in the discourse, I haven't seen competency-based education discussed as kind of the click-through you know, that piece of it, but I think you raised the peril of that. And when it comes to legislators, conservative state governors pushing institutions to do that, I mean, do you think that can actually yield results that will be good for the movement?
Well, I mean, I think it could. I mean, that's why I'm still excited about it. I mean, I think it could go either way. I mean, I think if we're really focused on making sure that students who have whatever it is that they have, a degree, a credential, a piece of paper, that it signifies something meaningful and not just that they either sat in a seat or they spent money, even if it was less money, but that it means something, I think that's wonderful. I mean, I think the employer piece is really important. You know, if governors are starting to talk to employers, not to make higher education a tool of employers, but I think as Pam said earlier, I mean, it's fascinating to me because I'm in all of these conversations. I'm in higher ed conversations, I'm in workforce conversations, but once you get beyond the sort of top line, this is about democracy, this is about jobs, the next level down conversations are absolutely the same, about the skills that I think higher ed thinks that it and aspires to, I don't know if it always does sort of provide, and what employers want. They're very, very similar. I mean, I told this to Carol Schneider a million times. When I hear her speak, I feel like, you know, she's from AAC&U and she speaks the speak of the liberal arts and the plea for competency-based education, how they go together. It's almost identical to what I hear folks from the Business Roundtable saying. So, but because we sort of pit ourselves against one another, I think we're not having a helpful conversation. But in terms of the state policy, if you bring these two things together, I think it could be very, very good for students and avoid just the sort of click-through you, cheaper.
What I would add to this is, and just putting my old policy hat on, I think policymakers don't generally like very complex messages, right? And so if the ALEC pressure is out there, that will force the field of innovators to very quickly come to some sort of agreement on words like this. What is competency-based education? There's a nice little incentive that's provided by having that unclear, incorrect dialogue out there, which is it forces those who are actually working in the space to start working very quickly in concrete manners. It also forces the field to start figuring out how are we going to generate the evidence to push back on those claims and to sort of say, it's not about a $10,000 degree, it's about this. And I think having that pressure, focuses the mind. And I hope that the folks on this stage and the folks out there who are working on competency sort of see the danger and uncertainty in how this field is being defined, and to know that you have a role in changing that. Otherwise, the promise might never be realized.
I also think that policymakers respond to stories.
Yep.
And one of the things that we're learning in the case studies that we're doing on institutions and students that are in this field is that if you really look at how these programs are being designed and carried out and the thoughtful ways in which the competency frameworks are being established and what the students are saying about them and what they're gaining from them, if those messages could be taken to employers and legislators and those who like simple messages, if those could be taken, then I think we would be not as likely to have the backlash about it's just cheaper. Because what students say is not that. What they say is what this reflection on their own learning and the application of that learning in demonstration, what that means for their own efficacy in the workplace or in life. And so I think we need to depend more on real people on the ground who have been affected by these stories, by these experiences, to tell the stories.
The other thing to note, as we're going through the experience of the institutions so far that have built and launched these programs, is it's not cheaper.
That's exactly right.
It is not cheaper for an institution to get into this ballgame. It's a very expensive investment for the institution to make.
But once they're up and running and scaled.
But once they're up, there is a break-even point
This
a
gets
few
to
years
my
out.
next question here, the piece we haven't talked yet. Reading the comments on Inside Higher Ed, which I try not to do too much, no offense. There's incredibly deep skepticism among faculty quarters about this really just being a way to eliminate jobs, to get efficiencies and scale. And what would your response be to folks who feel that just innate skepticism?
I would say that that's probably fundamentally misguided. All the institutions that I have worked with and that I know CBN works with have been very conscious and thoughtful about how they delineate faculty roles in these new programs. And in fact, this is a huge source of the diversity in the programs, because they understand culturally that that there are certain schools that are not going to accept certain types of things, and there are other schools that are more open to, and governance instructions that are more open to different roles and whatever. So there's a huge diversity of how that plays out in these programs. So I think we should be very, very careful about just laying a blanket, it means the end of the faculty role. No, it means changes in the faculty role. And in fact, it can be that your faculty ends up doing more of what they actually love to do and less of the things that they don't want to do. Or it might be that they get to engage in things from a different angle than they ever have before. I think that I was just on the phone with somebody who's administrator for one of the programs and actually ended up teaching a CBE class, and she was delighted with the experience of teaching it because it allowed her to do things with her students that she couldn't do before because she had to move everybody along at the same place and same time, blah, blah, blah. So actually, I would say, before they pan it, try it, because there are some amazing opportunities for faculty in this program.
Well, so I would just use an example. This isn't about a CBE program, but similarly, I think a competency-based course that maybe some folks in this room have experienced. So Wesleyan and Bryn Mawr, and I got this from your publication. So Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative, I don't know how many folks are familiar with it, but basically it's grounded in cognitive science, and it enables students to learn as much or more, I could go into the whole thing, as much or more sort of using this adaptive software as in a regular class in half the time. So all sorts of possibilities with that. You can see institutions just sort of picking that up and replacing their traditional courses with that. So Bryn Mawr and Wesleyan actually used that, and I think their organic chemistry course, I could be wrong about which course, but it was one of the science courses, and basically took their 14-week course, had their students take this portion of the course the first 7 weeks, and then and then the last 7 weeks they could do deeper project-based learning. I mean, the professors were happy because they were like, oh great, I don't have to spend my time doing this rudimentary sort of stuff that isn't that interesting for me, but it's critical for the students to be able to engage in deeper learning. And students could learn at their own pace, and then they actually got to apply it and do things that were interesting and meet students where they were, and it was much more rewarding for them and for the, it's more rewarding for the students and for the faculty. But can I go back to the policy piece for just a second? But so a problem with some of this adaptive learning software is, federal policy won't pay for it. There are all of these issues, and I'm thinking, just going back to that last question about the pitfalls with the cheaper, and I hear what you're saying, and I think the folks who are working in this space right now are good actors. They are the ones who are, really trying to make this happen. But I think, and I just have to do my sort of apologist for the federal government role, which is what I often do. Like once you change the policy to enable that to happen at scale, that's when the problem happens, and it can happen very quickly. So when I say I'm worried about it, it's not because I'm worried that it's happening now, but the number, and Paul's heard me say this a million times, but the number of calls that I get, and from investors, from venture capital firms, from folks who are trying to figure out where the next big thing is, who are saying this is sort of the next gold mine, that worries me. And I don't want to underestimate that, especially at the federal policy level. You have $150 billion on the line, and if all of a sudden we sort of say, hey, all these folks are great actors and they're doing good things and they're really trying to help students, so let's change the way that we dispense federal financial aid for everyone, I can't imagine a situation in which it doesn't get abused the next day. So we just need to be careful.
Related to that, with any emerging model, I think you generally have to hit a higher bar than the established models. And that's just a fact of life. You can complain about it, but it is what it is. And I think for competency-based ed, as it expands, there's going to be scrutiny. And I think if there are missteps, they will be publicized heavily. So where in that sphere, where are accreditors, where is the federal government, where would you like to see more communication, more standards? Anyone want to take it on to start?
Go.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, at the convening that we held in September on competency-based education, there was quite a dialogue, I would say, between the federal government representatives and the accreditors and the institutions. And it was clear, at least to those in the room, that right now the messages from the department are completely unclear, that institutions are confused about what the department is really trying to do or wants to see, that the experimental sites initiative is still confusing to institutions and filled with constraints. And I think that's probably why they have so few applications at this point. And the accreditors seem to be clearer, at least the three that were there, about what they could support, and the institutions that had come to them, either with a competence model or a direct assessment model, they seemed to be fairly clear about what the institutions wanted to do and were advocating for them to move forward. But they seemed to be frustrated that the department, that they couldn't figure out why they couldn't get decisions from the department. So I have a sense that maybe we're just in a time when the department itself hasn't completely figured out how to navigate in this space, and therefore the messages out to the higher ed community are equally confusing. So it seems to me that we need a more, a kind of not a standard statement by the feds. I wouldn't like to see them setting the standards. But at least a statement of what are they looking for in terms of who qualifies for direct assessment and what are they looking for in the experimental sites initiative itself.
I think that the feds are supposedly coming out with another Dear Colleague letter on direct assessment.
Those always help. They're always very, very helpful.
Is that sarcastic?
On CBE writ large, I think.
Okay. I mean, but generally, from my perspective, the layperson reporter, this administration, this department is supportive of competency-based education.
Yes.
We agree on
Oh,
that?
yes.
And do you see that changing in a different administration, a Republican administration?
I don't, actually. I don't, I think, because it's just common sense. It just makes sense to everybody.
It's one of the few issues there's
Yeah,
bipartisan
it's just
support.
a good
I've seen
bipartisan-
The House,
Yeah.
the House of Representatives,
Yeah.
for heaven's sakes, unanimously voted on something other than a post office naming to pass a competency-based education demonstration bill. I mean,
Yes.
there's bipartisan legislation introduced on the Senate side. It's one of the few areas in which there really is.
Yeah, I don't think it will, I agree with you. I think
So where does it come from then? I mean, I have some guesses, but where in the department do you get these contradictory messages, this lack of clarity? I heard Alison.
Well, I don't want to answer that question. And I'm fascinated. I would love for Amy to answer that particular question, but I want to go back to the question before about the channels of communication, right? Dysfunctional channels of communication. Because I think, that we had in April of 2013 an opportunity to bring regional accreditors, members of the Department of Ed, both political and career staff, which actually gets to part of your answer on this question that I'm not answering, and institutions together for the first time in conversation. And it was like, I think what we were most alarmed by was how much like a therapy session it was, right? So people emerged and people from the department said, everybody looks at me like I'm a bureaucrat, and today I was seen as a person. And, it was like, and somebody from an institution said, I had no idea how dysfunctional the channels of communication were between the accreditors and the Department of Ed. And then somebody else said, I had no idea that regional accreditors, are not, that they at that point did not seem, and I think that has since changed, but they don't appear to be interested in getting on the same page about anything, right? And for good reason, right? So I think one of the things that we learned as observers of that is that all of these different actors are responding to different constraints, different obligations, and therefore we are the product of our conditions, right? And so finding better ways for the department and regional accreditors and institutions to have the kinds of conversations they need to have is really difficult. And it's critical work, and it is not one-off kind of work, right? And we have very few, surprisingly few, channels for better communication, but they seem to be growing, so.
Just very quickly, so we're going to open this up to questions in just a few minutes, so get ready to come up to the front here if you have them. And just to tell a quick story to your point, there was a head of a regional accreditor called me once to complain that when I would allow folks to tee off on accreditors for stifling innovation, I would name this accreditor. And then when I talked about the approval of a direct assessment program, I did not name that accreditor. So they're definitely in a tough spot.
Yeah, they're in a tough spot.
Do anyone want to tackle the department piece?
I will. I will, again, being the apologist now, so I'm always critical of the department, except for that when I'm not. So it's interesting to hear your reflections on how you thought the accreditors were clear. I didn't think that. So I don't think anybody's clear, and I think that the channels of communication are fundamentally broken, and they're broken in various directions. I mean, at that meeting, one of the accreditors said, yeah, the department is going to come out with guidance, but as they said in Gone with the Wind, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. I mean, there's this sort of, everybody has their role, and the accreditors don't want to be told what to do by the department, and, I mean, it's a mess, and I think, and this will be really unpopular, I think part of the problem is everybody is punting on the issue of quality, right? So the department is sort of saying, well, we don't want to get into it because we don't want to set the standards. So, okay, accreditors, you're the ones who are dealing with quality, and then the accreditors say, okay, well, we don't really determine like what the quality is. We have a process for ensuring quality, and institutions, you're doing the quality. But then we see that there's all this evidence of not a great deal of evidence about student learning. The department has an inspector general that then sort of comes around to make sure that all of these decisions, which are expensive decisions, again, I keep going back to the $150 billion, because it's not just the department just sort of saying, oh, well, we want to, butt our noses in here. There's a lot of money on the line. they get chastised by the Inspector General, who says, hey, wait a minute, you're punting on this issue of quality, and the accreditors aren't monitoring it. They're not holding, they think they are, but we actually have found that there's not a lot of evidence for that. And the accreditors say, we don't know what to do. So everybody is a product of their sort of constraints and choices, or not even choices, of their constraints. But I think it's more complicated. I think that fundamentally there needs to be more communication and all of that, but at some point somebody's going to have to say, we can't just say, well, we know it when we see it quality and we're not going to hold anybody accountable for it.
Your story there reminds me of when there were congressional hearings a couple years ago on for-profit abuses. The accreditors were the ones in the hot seat in Capitol Hill. So I think the punt ends up with them generally.
And that's a really important point, because when you look, when we talk about being the product of our circumstances and our constraints, we're also the product of our histories, right? And so when the department says we'd like to create a safe space for responsible innovation, trust us, and the accreditors have just been, dragged in front of a committee and publicly flogged, there's not a lot of confidence that actually is possible, right? And so, histories of mistrust and suspicion, as well as simply competing, conflicting roles, make it very difficult for people to establish the kind of trust that's necessary for, or the channels of communication that build the trust that make the work possible. So
anyone, if you've got a question, come on up. Ooh, I think we have one right here. If you could say who you are and where you work and make it a question, please.
My name is Mark Byron. I'm in Fisher College, and I'm an online competency instructor. First of all, I just want to settle on the Wisconsin.
Oh, sorry about that.
We can hear you back there.
Quickly tell the story about them. They have 5 million residents in the state. The dean of the business school led this campaign, and they found 1 million residents with partially completed degrees. Basically said, faculty, this is where I'm going, and we're going to do a mailing and hit 20,000 students.
Right.
So it's a great story, so there is some data. My question is about...
I think we got someone who's going to turn your microphone on there.
The microphone's not on. People in the back can't hear you.
There we go.
My question is about the student. I think that one thing the students have to realize is that their work experience and their college experience adds up to competencies, and they lack the skills in translating them for an employer. Competencies, to me, are a common language that education can share with business. It's pretty simple to me. So what are we doing, what are schools doing to help the students understand how to document a competency, how to talk about it in an interview and align with an employer when they're in that interview situation?
Or in transcripts. Anyone want to take that on? Holly?
Go ahead. Well, I know in the case of some of them, they are helping students create these e-portfolios, which they then can carry to an employer and use it as a basis for discussing what they can do in response to a solicitation for a job. So the institutions are making a real effort to help the student document what they know. But that's not across the board what we see.
It's also the case that a number of institutions building programs are working with employers in new ways. So Lipscomb University, is Charlotte in the room at this point? She's sitting in the shadows, look at that. Go find her and talk to her, don't let her hide. So there are a number of institutions that are working, and SNU is here. Paul, you're here, yeah? There he is. So there are a number of institutions that are working closely with employers. I think the work that WGU and Sally Johnstone, go get her too, working with community colleges on these programs. These are KCTCS and others. There are a lot of institutions that are finding themselves in the course of building these programs needing to develop new ways of communicating with employers, building employers into this work, and then as they think about how to reach the students who are the best fit for their programs, right, to articulate that to students. You also kind of hit on there's a bunch of technical challenges around transcripting, right? So when we asked institutions, what are the biggest challenges that you're facing outside of policy and regulation, they said, communications and storytelling, right? How do we talk to our students? How do we talk to our faculty? How do we talk about this? actual quality assurance and support on curriculum design, choice of assessment, assessment validity, and the other was back office systems and processes. None of our systems and processes were designed to allow us to do this thing that we want to do, right? So I don't know if that's exactly an answer to your question, but there are technical pieces to it, but there's also functional pieces to it and new opportunities to communicate with students because institutions are working with employers in new ways.
Registrars have a lot to do on this
Yes,
work.
exactly.
Yes, they do.
And I think the general point, which I think is something that needs to also be built out over the next 10 years, is that the other part of the equation here are the students, right? Students don't know what to ask for. Students, they're lucky that they found their way into your program. To then make the next step, like, you know what, I really could use an e-portfolio, or hey, can somebody in the career office help me talk to these employers to demonstrate the competencies that I have? They don't know what to ask for, but guess what, if you can tell them what they should ask for, and we can do that in a broad way, that will be that much more powerful in sort of creating that market, creating that understanding amongst employers and students and institutions, but what actually helps lift that credential off the page and gets them that job that they're looking for. They just don't know.
It's also the case that a lot of programs are doing like intro to competency-based education as part of their onboarding for students, right? Like this is a very different way of thinking about and navigating higher ed and what does this mean for you and how does it connect? So a lot of that has to do with the communication from the outset in recruiting.
And some of the institutions are doing sort of parallel transcripting. So like they'll have a transcript that looks like you got to be in a class because a competency isn't awarded for anything less than 80%. So, you know, there's ways to sort of like work around it and make it look like things that other people are used to looking at and evaluating. And then they're creating competency-based transcripts that give more in-depth looks at what the student has actually accomplished and perhaps link to an e-portfolio where they can show this is the thing that I produced that you can go look at and see for yourself what it was.
Let's move to question 2 over here for Daniel.
Good morning. I'm Zorica Pantić, president of Wentworth Institute of Technology here in Boston. And I think competency-based education is very important, especially for adult learners. And we've been doing some kind of work already at Wentworth. My concern is really about the undergraduate programs. For us, we have programs in engineering, technology, design, and management, and our accreditation agencies do require that we prove that students have specific learning outcomes, which is really competencies that the students have to have. And for example, Accreditation Board for Engineering Technology established that in 2000, so it's not a new approach. I think we also have technology to measure throughout the class or the term of the course how students are performing. My question is really if you had any thoughts about how do you actually handle students who get maybe to their all competencies before the end of the semester, because it's really what you're talking about is not so much competencies because we already look at that, but it's the timeline. And that's going to be a very disruptive, really, approach in higher education if you look at the undergraduate students. And I don't know if you have thought about that and what your opinions are about that. How do you move students through the whole curriculum if they're achieving their competencies sooner than the others?
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about self-pacing and the super fast performers. Anyone want to talk about the challenges?
Well, I think credit. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to think. I think the real concern is with the not super fast. Like the super fast performers are an outlier anyway. I think there's going to be some that are just going to hit this. They've done half the stuff already, and they're going to just charge through and be done. And good. That's what competency-based is for, right? What we're learning though is, and what we know now is that. Having no pacing or being completely open-ended about how fast you move through isn't good for students. Having more time is helpful in some respects, but not in completion respects all the time. So it's an important component to some of these programs is the student success coaches and the supports that help keep students on track and moving at a pace that's comfortable and achievable and doable, but is moving. So I think the more important concern is thinking about how do we make sure that people are pacing in a way that's going to get them to complete. So,
What are you going to think about pacing in the context of a federal college rating system and completion rates? Let's not even go there.
yeah.
Are you also asking about the actual systems that underpin the pacing.
Yes,
Right.
it's the system that helps with pacing students. Yes, you're going to have some high achievers that are going to maybe within half a semester achieve all the competencies. You'll have the middle, which is maybe takes 3/4 of the semester, and then some toward the end that it's going to take a full semester. So the idea with the CBE is that you can move students faster through the programs if they achieve their competencies, which work well with adult learners and the online programs. But if you have a specific classroom work, that's a little bit more difficult. So that's the underpinning of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would want to say about the infrastructure that underpins it is a lot of the institutions that we've been working with and studying, when they start small, they have to do the systems in many ways almost without technology in the beginning, because it's the only way they can track the different paces of the different students. Almost all of them are looking for some technology infrastructure which will enable them to actually track the students in the ways that would be required to have people completing at different points. And there are a number of new technology platforms out there that are designed to help institutions do this, but it is disruptive because you have to have, if you're an institution with a legacy system, a set of programs based on the credit hour and tracking systems based on the credit hour, then you need a different system that deals with self-pacing. And a lot of colleges don't start those systems at the beginning. They end up improvising for a period of time while they look for a technology that will help them with the pacing issue. And so I do think there are technology solutions out there, though, that are going to be able to help institutions who want to do this. It's a lot easier just to create a new unit or a new college to do this than it is to transform an existing institution's program structure and tracking mechanisms. And I think it's the latter that is going to be the real challenge as we move forward with this movement, not the creation of whole new units that just do this. That's easier.
Great question.
Well, the fundamental question is, do some students graduate with their degree in 2 years and some graduate in 4 years, and how you can address it?
But isn't that, I guess that's sort of the point, right? It's not that it's a 4-year degree, but that a degree means that you know and can do a certain, body of things. And so, in fact, like I don't see that as a problem at all. I see that as the beauty. If why should you have to spend 2 additional years sitting and not learning anything if you don't need it? So.
I agree with that, and just talking about the logistics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure. And we even heard the D word there. So next question here.
Hi,
Disruption.
I'm Doug Brown from Massasoit Community College here in Massachusetts. My question is actually the opposite. We've been experimenting with competency-based education and developmental math. And one of the things I love about that option is the time is variable piece.
Yep.
But usually in this discussion, it's always focused on the time is variable so you can accelerate.
Yeah, that's right.
And what we see, and you touched on that already, is a lot of times it's not the acceleration,
That's
it's
right.
actually the extension of time.
Extension of time.
Which can be good,
Yes.
can also cause some challenges. And so I was just curious about at the policy level, is there discussion acknowledging the fact that competency-based education may actually increase learning time?
Yeah, I don't think, so certainly,
Yeah.
like,
We're having that
we're talking about it. But I don't think policymakers are at all. I mean, I think that policymakers
They
just sort of
see it as
think
a
it's a
speed
way to
cut.
do it faster, cheaper. But in fact, if we believe, or I'll just say, I believe that there probably are a number of students who are moving forward right now, who are completing right now, who actually haven't learned a lot. And once you sort of make learning the constant, that's really going to be problematic for some students,
That's right.
right? It's going to be really hard. I mean, I think, and I think it would really hamper completion efforts, and it could absolutely be slower. And no, I don't think policymakers are talking about it. I think it's sort of the dirty little secret. And I guess I'm okay with it being a little dirty secret right now for us to try to, as long as the people who are implementing are aware of it, right? I still want the policy momentum to be going forward, but I think it's absolutely a real issue.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is not surprising. Not surprising.
It's what the institutions are actually dealing with, right? Not what do we do when students accelerate, it's what do we do when students are simply not able to get over that, that hump of this competency or this piece? How do we support that learner, right?
Do you think that, I mean, beyond policymakers, society might not be all that comfortable with having to prove what they know?
Absolutely. I mean, how many of us would have degrees right now if we had actually proved what we know and are able to do?
Sometimes when I look at those competency frameworks, I wonder if I could have gotten a degree.
Right.
I think people are more scared by that than we all might think.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Great question. One more over here.
I'm Larry Michaelenko from actually Taconic High School and Berkshire Community College, and I teach manufacturing. And I was wondering if you ever looked at the Chapter 74 Massachusetts competency-based vocational way that we do it in the state and would use that for higher ed.
No, but could you tell us about it?
Yeah, would you say more about it?
The way that it works, there's probably 60-plus trades in the state that have all competencies hooked to it for high school students. And the way they came up with the competencies was between the instructors and employers over a number of years. And recently, we just updated them in 2014. So in a specific trade, a student has 6 different strands that they have to meet competencies in. And the way they do it is they physically have to produce a product, in my case. And what I'm finding is that I can get a 4-year high school student employed faster than I can my community college student. So we're starting to switch over to do more competency-based in our manufacturing program at the community college. The problem is the college students are at a disadvantage because they don't have enough time on task. It takes students such a long time to get to a certain competency that when you fit it into 3-4 credit courses and break it up, that doesn't work. But on the flip side, too, what happens is a college student may get the certificate for manufacturing and get hired, but it doesn't count as a positive for us because they didn't go all the way through with their degree because they were able to get employment faster.
Right.
Yep.
So has anybody looked at that or what the, how that could be remedied? Or how, I know everybody says you want to get it done faster. And usually what we do is a student meets certain competencies, and the ones that they can't meet isn't necessarily a negative. It's just that they're better in a different area.
Well, so this only answers one piece of that, but I think this, and as always, I'm going to go to like a favorite hobby horse of mine, which is better data. So I think part of the reason that we focused on completion, and completion is important, part of the reason completion is so important is because degrees are opaque, but we know that people who have degrees, that the labor market rewards those, right? But once you start to sort of break things down, there may be many students who don't need the whole degree, but they just need these, and they need and want these particular skill sets. So in California, for example, California has they have a really good data system in their community colleges, and they're able to look at employment outcomes for students in their community colleges. And they've found that there are indeed students who take a particular set of courses that aren't bundled by the institution, but they sort of come in, they don't complete, they don't get a certificate, they don't get anything. They just they take 2 or 3 courses, and they get this big bump in earnings. And because the community college system has been able to look at sort of data and look at everything holistically, they're able to identify that these particular courses must be giving them competencies that are valued in the labor market. That's great. And I mean, in my mind, those schools should be rewarded for those and not penalized as having non-completers.
Right.
But the problem is you can't, again, from a policy point of view, though, you can't just sort of say, trust the institutions. Oh, yeah, we have all these students who are coming in and aren't finishing, but they're getting great jobs.
Yeah.
No, I'm not really going to trust that. But if there's data behind it, then that starts to be really compelling. So I think that in order for us to think the way that you're thinking, we need to be much more granular, both about identifying the competencies and then sort of measuring them and measuring the returns, particularly for the trades and for explicitly career-oriented competencies in the marketplace.
I would just add that this question and the last question, there's a commonality. It has to do with the currency of higher ed, right? So everything tied to the credit hour. So sometimes we get asked, what's so bad about the credit hour, right? And the last 2 questions have shown us exactly what the problem with the credit hour is, right? It's a currency that it's the only currency we have for higher ed, but it's not one that allows institutions and learners to do this, to actually tie progress toward degree or advancement in the labor market to what you know and are able to do, right?
I think too that the thing that you both the questioner and Amy are pointing to is that we're gonna start feeling some pressure to go towards micro credentials and other something besides a degree, you know, where people can be rewarded and acknowledged and perhaps even given financial aid for efforts that don't look like a complete four-year box.
Well, we have great questions.
One more comment for if you're looking for data, Massachusetts Educational Partnership that works with advanced manufacturing in particular. It's a nonprofit that they have a system levels 1 through 5 that go from basic shop math up to a degree program. And right now they're keeping data on what students are passing that and how far up that ladder that they're going. Contact would be Leslie Parody.
So we have time for one more quick question and quick answer. So.
Mark Rotundo, Cambridge College. A very quick question. We talk about this being different. We talk about this being something that's exciting and new. But we have research, and so playing devil's advocate from a faculty's member, when we look at student engagement, what do you envision as the system that keeps students engaged? What are the systems we create for those psychosocial things that students learn while they're going through college? The degree is more than just a commodity. College experience is more than a commodity. What do we envision for that?
Well, I mean, just a couple comments real quick. You know, absolutely what you're saying is true. That, you know, and so acknowledging that that's the goal is an important piece. And what I see most of the institutions doing to try to achieve that student support and development is having a variety of support systems that are created for coaching, for mentoring, for peer conversation. Even programs that are totally online are doing that, recognizing that we need to have all those things in order for the student to grow in all the ways that you're suggesting. So I think the design of the support systems is as important as the design of the competence modules and the assessment system itself. And if we can do that in a very conscious, clear way about what students need at all ages, then I think we could address your concern.
I think that competency-based education also naturally provides opportunities for the most engaging type of learning you can have, which is sort of problem-based solving. There's nothing more fun as a learner than to actually apply what you're doing to something. So just as an example, you know, I liked high school algebra just fine, but I had no clue that quadratic equations were actually applied in real life by engineers to make things. I didn't know that quadratic equations had any other purpose than to drive me crazy and make me take a test. But competency modules, because they're anchored around what can you do, the learning gets applied. You get project-based learning, you get team-based learning projects among people in classes. There are learning communities. I know at SNU, the students have learning communities within their efforts, and so the idea that I think people have this idea that, you know, you're going to go online, you're going to do something, you're going to click, 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 and the learning isn't engaging. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, all of this is really how creative can your faculty and instruction designers be about making the learning engaging. And the technology is, you know, we have technology that can support and enable those things. But at the end of the day, you're right. You know, the learning has to be engaging, but competency-based learning is.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up here. Please join with me in thanking our panelists for a great session.